What's going on, YouTube? It's Chris here for Friendly Frenzy Games, and today I'm going to do my absolute best to describe the tips and strategies that I learned and used to walk you through all 10 levels of the Gambler challenges in Red Dead Redemption 2. Essentially, for the Gambler set of challenges, you're going to be taking part in table games like poker, Blackjack, Dominoes, and Five-Finger Fillet in alleys and saloons all across Red Dead Redemption 2's vast map. The Gambler challenges are widely regarded as the most difficult in the game, but I honestly believe that for the most part their premise is quite simple. What's really challenging though about these is that even with a strategy, the game's mechanics and RNG can feel entirely against you at some points. So take this video with a grain of salt, but I do hope that in some way it helps you. Let's dig in. Upon completion of the 10th and final Gambler challenge, you're going to have the ability to purchase all 4 Gambler-specific equipment upgrades that will increase the ammunition carrying capacity and reduce the amount of maintenance required for your main and secondary weapons. After you've purchased the entire set, you're also going to get a permanent stamina tank bar increase. Now, aside from the equipment unlocks and the permanent stat boost, possibly what's most important is obtaining progress towards 100% completion of the game. The Gambler challenges, alongside all other challenges in the game, will need to be fully completed as a requirement to achieve 100% completion of RDR2 and ultimately obtain the Best in the West trophy and achievement. So let's get into how to complete each level. First, to unlock the Gambler set of challenges, you're going to need to win a round of poker. Now, I personally didn't play any of these games for the first time until I had to for missions, and it just so happens that early on in Chapter 2, you're going to have the option to play poker before going to find Reverend Swanson in the Who Is Not Without Sin story mission. You'll want to choose to play poker. In the first hand of the game, you're guaranteed to win. So if you're like me, this is going to be your introduction to the Gambler set of challenges. Now, since the challenge is unlocked after this point, you're going to now need to win another 4 rounds of poker to complete level 1. Since you're guaranteed to win here, you could theoretically replay this mission 4 more times to complete the challenge, but if you do this, make sure that you complete the mission each time because otherwise your progress towards the challenge will not count. Now, honestly, I'm not that great at poker, and it's really not something that I enjoy, so I personally found it easiest to complete the challenge this way. Alternatively, though, if you're later on in the game, you could also run the mission A Fine Night of Debauchery, as you're guaranteed to win the 2 rounds of poker on the boat as well. If farming missions isn't up your alley, then feel free to pop in and out of the saloons in Valentine, St. Denis, or Blackwater, and if you're lucky, you may even have the opportunity to play at camp. Placing minimum bets will afford you many opportunities to attempt this if you have the coin, but unless you enjoy poker, it could end up taking much more time than running these few missions. But the choice is definitely yours. With level 1 out of the way, we now move on to level 2, where you're going to need to double down in Blackjack and win the hand 5 times. To do this, head to the Saloon in Rhodes, Van Horn Trading Post, or Blackwater and approach the table. Now, Blackjack is much simpler in premise compared to poker, as you're really just playing against the dealer no matter how many people are actually at the table. Really, all you're trying to do here is get closer to a total of 21 than the dealer without going over. Now, choosing double down draws you a card and doubles your bet, but you can't draw any more cards after you've doubled down. So ideally, you would do this in situations where you're going to need only 1 card to get you as close to 21 as possible. For example, like I did here at 14 versus not doubling down when you're at 20. Either way though, as long as you've got a little bit of money and only place the minimum bet, you're probably best to double down on anything that you would actually have a reasonable chance at reaching 19, 20, or 21, since there's no penalty for losing aside from being out a few cents. After you've successfully doubled down and beat the dealer 5 times, you'll unlock Gambler 3. Gambler 3 is definitely one of the simpler games and challenges in the entire Gambler set, as you're going to just have to win 3 games of Five-Finger Fillet. Now, there's 3 different locations that you can visit to play the game: Valentine, Strawberry, or the Van Horn Trading Post. Now each one of these is going to have its own variation of 5-finger fillet, but all of them are very similar and they each use the same patterns depending on the level that you're on. Now to complete this easily, what I learned was that the sequences that you have to complete actually scale in complexity with each new challenger if you're at the same table. For instance, I completed 2 of them in Van Horn Trading Post and then went to Valentine to face off against that town's level 1 opponent. Since the first pattern is very easy to remember and replicate, I would highly recommend venturing to all 3 locations and complete the challenge by defeating each level 1 opponent using the same 2-button sequence, although it might take you a little longer due to the travel. After you've won your 3rd game, you'll unlock Gambler 4. Now for Gambler 4, you're going to need to take players out of the poker game in each of the 3 poker locations. This one, like many of the other levels going forward, are going to be very situational, but I'm going to share some things that helped me complete this in hopes that somewhere, some way, it can help you as well. First, I seem to have the most success by checking and calling unless I had a really good hand. And by that, I mean cards with high numbers or face cards like a jack, queen, king, or ace. Now, if I had a pair of cards, regardless of what they were, I would go all in every time. Some NPCs will call your bluff and match your bet, but I definitely found it a lot easier trying to play with something that I felt was decent versus trying to bluff or trying to get a read on if the NPCs were bluffing. If any community cards matched what I had in my hand as they were turned up, I went all in as well. Now this is definitely going to lose you a little bit more money than playing Blackjack, but I definitely found it the quickest way to complete this. Also, if different NPCs keep winning and none of their wallets are getting low enough to bust out, you might want to consider visiting a different location or sleeping and returning, because to force the NPCs into making big plays and to eventually bust them out, you're going to need to have more money and better cards than them. Now the last real tip that I have here is that you are going to need to be the one to bust out the player. You can't just be sitting at the table and have another NPC do it. So if an opportunity presents itself where the poorest player at the table is betting all in and you haven't folded yet, sometimes honestly it's just worth calling their bluff and hoping that you've got better cards than them. Now again, I don't play poker at all, but really with the only strategy that I had in completing this being what I just mentioned, I'm hoping that you can find something in here as well. It really didn't take me all that long to complete, and after you bust out a player at each of the 3 locations, you'll be able to move on to Gambler 5. Gambler level 5 is our first introduction to the last table game in RDR2, Dominoes. Like 5-finger fillet, there's 3 variations of Dominoes, one in each of Emerald Ranch, Saint Denis, and Blackwater. I personally like Dominoes draw games the best, even though I've heard that they take a little longer to complete. It's what felt the most familiar to me, and it was a little easier to at least try and come up with a strategy to win the rounds and eventually the game. Now the draw version of Dominoes is only available at the Emerald Ranch location at the station, which is in the middle of the map, east of Valentine. To complete this challenge, you're going to need to win 3 rounds of Dominoes without drawing a single tile, while playing against 2 opponents or less. This requirement is necessary because at a full table, there aren't actually any dominoes to be able to draw. Now I found this easiest to complete against 2 opponents since there aren't as many tiles to draw from versus just playing against a single opponent, plus there's an additional player who may need to also draw from the tile pool. However, I found the rounds themselves much more difficult to win with more players at the table because it did make it significantly more difficult to try and put together a strategy for placing your own matched dominoes. If you do reach the domino table and there's more than 2 opponents, be sure to sleep as long as you can to pass time and then return. If the table's still full, you can try saving and loading your game to progress time as well. Do this until a spot or 2 frees up, but be sure that you aren't trying to complete this challenge at a full table, otherwise your progress will not count. Now in terms of strategies for the game itself, my biggest pointer would be to pay attention to what numbers your opponents aren't playing, or specifically when they need to draw tiles. From here, do everything that you can to exploit the numbers that you're banking on them not to have, so they don't have a place to play their dominoes and they need to continue to draw more tiles. Otherwise, this really appears to be a game of luck with just a facade of strategy. Regardless, at least you only need to win 3 rounds and not 3 whole games, but once you've done that, you'll unlock Gambler 6. Gambler 6 might just be the fastest and easiest challenge in all of the Gambler set, as really all you're going to need to do is beat the Blackjack dealer in both Rhodes and Van Horn. Again, this is going to be a random situational challenge, so I can't quite give you the exact method to complete this, but placing minimum bets to try and get closer to 21 than the dealer, you'll eventually beat him in each of the 2 specific locations and unlock Gambler 7. Gambler 7 is actually another fairly easy one as well, because it just says that you need to beat the 5-finger Fillet player in each of the 3 locations: Strawberry, Van Horn, and Valentine. This does mean though that you're going to need to play each variant of the game, but as I said earlier, they are very similar. What's simple about this challenge is the fact that you only need to beat the first opponent at each table, and since again the sequences scale in complexity with the more challengers that you face off against at a single table, they reset at each location. This means that you'll be able to use the same 2-button combo to take out the first challenger at each of the 3 locations to complete this challenge quickly and easily before proceeding to Gambler 8. Gambler 8 is simple in premise, but it's left almost entirely to the game's RNG. It says that you're going to need to win 3 hands of blackjack with 3 hits or more. Now this essentially means that you're going to need to be closer to 21 than the dealer without going over and while having at least 5 cards. This is 2 from your starting hand as well as 3 additional cards, 1 from each hit. Now as I've said before, this is purely situational, but some things that I learned while trying to complete this are: first, if it's at all possible, try and get a seat to the most right of the dealer as you're looking at him. This is because he hands cards out from his left to his right, and if you're dealt your cards first each time, you don't actually need to wait for the other players to take their turn, and you're able to repeat your attempts much quicker. Secondly, you're really only going to want to attempt to play your hand if you have a low card total. Now, I personally never played starting totals higher than 9 between my first 2 cards, and even still, that can be a bit of a gamble as the next 3 cards that you draw can only total 12 without putting you over 21. Remember that face cards like jacks, queens, kings all count for 10, and an ace can be either 1 or 11. In any case, you're going to want to have the ace count as 1 while completing this challenge, but the game will pick up on that and auto-adjust. Now lastly, if you draw a hand that isn't worth playing, you can leave the table, which will forfeit your bet though, so don't ever bet more than the minimum as you're likely going to be repeating this process a lot. And as long as you're able to sit down again before the dealer shuffles the cards, you're able to start a new game right away. Now after you've won 3 hands of poker with 5 or more cards, you'll unlock the next grueling challenge, Gambler 9. Gambler 9, I'll admit right out of the gate, it's a struggle, but I do have a few tips to hopefully make your situation a little easier. Again, like the earlier domino challenge, I much preferred the draw variation of dominoes, which is only available at Emerald Ranch. Also, I slept, saved, and loaded the game until I got a table where there was only 1 opponent. Personally, for me, the game seemed to take a little longer because the points didn't typically add up as fast, but I at least felt like I could string my pieces together a little better, and it gave me the opportunity to pay closer attention to the tiles that my single opponent might have versus an entire table being likely to make a move. This, in turn, definitely made for some frustrating sequences of endless tile pickups on both sides of the table, but on my first try at this challenge, I lost my 3rd game by only 9 points. For this challenge, you're going to need to win 3 games of dominoes in a row. Now, a few general thoughts that I had for strategy while playing versus 1 opponent were again very similar to the earlier domino challenge. You're going to want to pay as close attention to where your opponent isn't playing, especially if there are higher value dominoes on the field, as they would likely want to get rid of these points much earlier if they had them. Also, I tried as often as I could to play pieces that would allow me to make a move if my opponent is able to play on the domino that I am just dropping. For example, if I couldn't play my next domino on the one that I was placing, I usually had a backup that I could play in the opposite spot. Lastly, if the computer is picking up tiles because they can't play on a certain number, do not play something different than that number until you absolutely need to, just so that you can try to get them to rack up as many unclaimed tiles as possible to give you that little bit of an advantage. Now, as you begin to rack up your wins, if you're getting down to the wire and you feel the game kind of slipping away, for example, your opponent has a tile or two left and you've got much more, you can leave the table with your win streak intact. Don't wait too long to leave the game though, because if you wait until the last tile is placed, you run a very high chance that the game registers a loss. After you win 3 games of dominoes in a row, you will unlock Gambler 10. Gambler 10 is kind of a full circle moment. This, in theory, is actually very hard to complete, especially if you're not a fan of poker like me. The Gambler 10 challenge states that you're going to need to win 3 hands of poker in a row, which honestly is no small feat. I'd probably equate it to doing the previous domino challenge, but potentially it's even more difficult or more random. However, luckily for everyone, there's an easy workaround for it, and it's very similar to what we did in Gambler 1. What you're going to want to do for this one is, since you're guaranteed to win the 2 hands of poker, after you lose the first one on the boat in the Fine Night of Debauchery story mission in Chapter 4, complete the entire mission and you'll already have earned 2 out of the 3 winning poker hands for this challenge. To get the third and final one complete, you can go all the way back to Chapter 2 and complete the Who Is Not Without Sin story mission again, and when you do the mission replay, you start the mission directly in front of the poker table. You're just going to want to be sure here that you choose to play the game of poker before going to find the Reverend. Again, because you're guaranteed to win the first hand, you can leave after you've collected your earnings and then complete the rest of the mission to save your progress towards the challenge. After the last mission cutscene, you'll be returned to your free roam with Gambler 10 all completed, which that you can then visit a trapper to purchase your new equipment. Now, there's been many people who have asked for a guide on the Gambler challenges in Red Dead Redemption 2, and since I've finally worked my way through them, I wanted to just quickly share with you all how I did it. They definitely aren't the easiest to explain in a video because you won't be able to replicate the dominoes that I play or the cards that I play, but I do hope that I've provided at least some additional information to help you complete these challenges a little easier. If this video helped you, let me know in the comments and subscribe to Friendly Frenzy Games for much more Red Dead Redemption 2 content.